Thank you, Haya. And thank you very much for organizing this conversation. I think I wanted to, first of all, start with a personal note, Harald. And that has something to do with the discussions of this morning, planning scenarios and strategic planning. I think when we both discussed this conference, it was a very high priority for me, and I wanted to be here the entire time, and then in the end, and that to Claire and the audience in general, then something important happened. Like things happen in life, and although that was strategically very important for me, and then the executive council of our organization, they fixed the dates, and they coincided exactly with what the conference was. So I needed to make a very tough choice. And yesterday we also had the very first steering committee for the international year. I will speak about that in a second. So what I just want to demonstrate with this very personal little short anecdote is, although we planned so well, and I said I really need this discussion and I wanted to hear each and every piece, I was confronted with this dilemma of, how do I match that? I can't tell one thing no, and the other thing is even more important for me. So what I did was finding the last flight out of Madrid, arrived in Venice at 12 o'clock last night, drove until 3 o'clock this morning here, and get up after very little sleep this morning to listen to all the good presentations of today. That was my plan, and that is what the reality is. But maybe another anecdote on that one, because was it Sigit? Sigita, before she spoke about her experience with the military. I'm a colonel of the reserve in the German Armed Forces. I did that because I believed of it. And in the end, I also spent most of my time in the Ministry of Defense with planning, forward planning, planning for peace operations and not so peaceful operations. I also learned a lot, and what I especially learned was they are very resourceful and they have a lot of very well-trained people in planning. And although they plan a lot, not all of their plans become true. But I think with civil defense, these are the two institutions in government where I think most of the professionally paid planners on government, on behalf of government sit. The other thing, Harald, very often we have discussions. I just try to be right now realistic. I think twice a year we both have discussions, and they are not planned. They are spontaneous. Either I call Harald, and then the conversation turns longer. They are never planned, never, and or the other way around. And very often we end up then with very inspiring exchanges. And the one which I wanted to recall here, Harald, where I was very grateful when H1N1 was for us an issue. The tourism sector some 20 years ago was extremely challenged with SARS, and that was like a wake-up call. For the very first time, our ministers of tourism realized there's more than tourism discussions. There are others which are impacting us enormously. We were tasked to look more strategically into the issue of challenges of communicable diseases. That brought me then to we don't need to start from scratch. And that was one of the conversations I had with Harald, and you brought some very interesting people into very, how large was the room? 30, 40, 50 people and discussion. It inspired me enormously, and we took this inspiration then global. And in the end, a little anecdote. If you right now see communicable diseases nowadays being labeled after something which is no longer a place, that had its origin over there. I was fighting very, very long for that. And in the end, we ended the practice of labeling communicable diseases after the places where they were discovered, which was actually one of the biggest deterrents of the tourism sector to support fast and sincere reporting. Yeah, if you are actually rewarded by being named after a communicable disease you have discovered, then this is no longer an incentive. It is actually the contrary. And Claire, that was such a policy experience for me, because the community, WHO, we were supported by Margaret Chan, but she had headwinds, you cannot imagine, because the community is static, and academics were behind that. They were very static, and they took pride in labeling that after a certain place. And it included then later on also ending the practice of calling it Kreuzfeld-Jakob after indigenous people or after animals. So basically all the unnecessary practices until then. Okay, but this is just the second anecdote, and then I wanted here to you. I wanted to present here to you some of the insights how we are turning a process and some coincidences into something which will allow us to go much better informed into the post-2030 negotiation. And to explain that, I need to explain you how we went the last time into this process of negotiating the SDGs. And to do that, I first want to recall, and everybody feels that SDGs, those who have kids know, even in a kindergarten, we paint the walls with the 17 SDGs. You go to a bakery, alternative or not alternative way of producing bread, they are speaking about the SDGs. You go to schools, you go to companies, you go to local authorities, wherever you go, they speak about the SDGs. So we actually created, after the MDGs at the UN process, with the same beliefs as before, there was a process created which had an impact we are never telling as a positive story as UN officials. We are all the time trying to promote that we need to advance, but how that happened and what success was sitting actually behind that is a story very seldom told. And I want to tell the story from the perspective I know, the tourism perspective, and I can tell you it was pure coincidence. It was not strategically planned. The process, the tourism sector, the ministers were absolutely not aware of how to negotiate in that process. And the only thing I negotiated with our organization was SDG 8. 12 was negotiated by the environment industry, the environment sector, UNEP especially. It was nearly set for us, and 14 was the SITS community. These are the three areas where we have in the tourism sector a reference and where we have indicators. My comment, which I made before about the measurement, and I will come back to that again. And the funny story was then, in one of the meetings when we finished that, the new SG of ICAO, the Civil Aviation Organization, came to our SG and said, can we join the indicator? Because we indicate the indicators, the measurement units below. We were still negotiating how to do that. And she said, as we don't have an indicator, we missed the process of negotiation positioning us. Aviation is absolutely not reflected in the SDGs, but connectivity is important for development. So the entire argument started, and it was a testament of somebody who came late. With that, I told a little bit of the story of the previous SDG, basically to make the argument for the next. But before I do that, the next thing. And who was it before who spoke about the G20? Was it you, Claire? Very good. You said we took it to the G20, South Africa, last year, the presidency. I had to write for them. The resilience report for the G20 was super interesting. To my taste, the South African presidency had too much appetite for reports. That was a big challenge. But at the same time, what we prepared for them, the resilience report was very useful for what we are doing right now. The last time, or the first time I got involved with the G20 process was in 2011. We had economic difficulties in the tourism sector. We saw a way of facilitating employment, and then in the G20 tourism ministers meeting, they concluded, well, what is the best way of making the argument that tourism can help us lift the economy? And they said, well, facilitation, visa facilitation. So they came back, and at the beginning I was confronted with this issue and that didn't have a solution. I found it interesting that ministers of tourism said that visa facilitation could help, but how to approach that was the question. And this is a proxy story for the dilemmas when we try to resolve policy issues in tourism, which are no longer in our cubicle, in our goldfish bowl. And when you start looking then at who is actually the owner of visa policies facilitation, you very often see then it's foreign affairs and interior. Foreign affairs is making the tit for tat game. If you facilitate, I facilitate for you. If you don't facilitate, I don't facilitate for you. And then interior is the area where they say if something goes wrong and somebody illegally came into the country, it was because you were asking actually that we are lowering the barriers. So yeah, we could have done a classical report, but what we did was evidence. So we started to code. Shall I change the slide? I'm talking too much, Harald. Okay, but I'm fast with the slides. But I wanted to connect to because Claire inspired me before, and I wanted to connect to that one. And I thought that here we made for the very first time the argument of that through evidence we can actually overcome cubicles. That is our policy thing. So what we did was we created what was perceived from the tourism sector as a visa on arrival, e-visa, no visa, or a traditional visa. We coded globally. And then we presented it back. And what we said then later on, look, this is what your country is doing, that's what your competitor doing. And when you have a national tourism policy and you want to achieve A, B, C, you want to promote your country for MICE tourism, but your competitor is more open to the same source markets you are competing with, then you actually have a problem. So we resolved the tit for tat, and that is funny. It took us 5, 6, 7 years, but through evidence and a different approach with own evidence and with this own argument, we actually facilitated. We opened in certain countries entirely this tit for tat logic. That was Qatar. Qatar was absolutely locked, and the European Union back then, before they introduced right now the more restrictive ways, were also inspired by that. And the last thing, Harald, and I promise I will. How much time do I have actually? 5 minutes more? Also 10, okay. And the last thing I wanted to show was linking right now to one of the first slides. It was related to that, and we had the environment argument existing in our world for some time. Usually, our ministries just focused on the economic argument and measured the success of their action in arrivals and receipts. These are both economic indicators, and the rest was seen as we are using nature, we have maybe an impact on nature. But our very first reports were static. We reported what at that particular time we were doing. So the very first report on our climate impact was a static report. We attributed over there values which linked our footprint in, or was explaining our footprint as part of the global footprint. And that actually is provoking exactly what you don't want to provoke among policy makers, because it was a rather small footprint. So they said, so what? So what is the difference I can make in this particular case? So the first thing we had then very clear was we have to build scenarios, and the scenarios require that we model the tourism volume. And that was an eye-opener for us, because until then, our argument was always international tourist arrivals. And that's what everybody here in the room who is dealing with tourism is learning. We produced that. When I started in tourism, we measured our sector in millions. Now we measure it in billions. And we said by 2030, we have 1.8 billion international tourist arrivals, dominated by a Western thinking. Because we think a Swedish traveling to Norway or a Dutch traveling to Germany, that's an international tourist arrival. And we neglected the domestic dimension, which in environmental sense is the same. We neglected India, we neglected China, these volumes which have environmental and socially exactly the same impact than our so far Western dominated argument. So the first thing we came up with was, and we aligned with OECD, another very important lesson from my sense, alignment among international organizations, because our policymakers received the report from the WEF, they received the report from I don't know whom, OECD very likely, and then they receive one from the UN organization covering more or less the same thing. So they have three competing data sets. They don't know which of those is more reliable. My argument before, perfect is the enemy of good. So we aligned with OECD, with ITF, and we modeled. And we came up that by 2030, actually, it's not 1.8 billion. We have 37 billion domestic and same-day trips. So a totally different dimension of what this tourism sector reflects. And we looked already into 2050, and that was when I then came back to Aldo and said, good Lord, what do we see here ahead as movements? And that is when, Roland, the last time we started then to reflect, this tourism sector maybe is not called an economic activity in 50, 60, 70 years from now, because it's reflecting something we only can explain when we really look back in history. This is not something we explain by these are paid holidays, and during these paid holidays, I'm going just somewhere. This is something different. It's a change of our societies. If we see these enormous volumes, and that is the increasing middle class. And that is where we started to become then concerned, because it is actually something explained by curiosity, by other elements which are deeply embedded in us and made us travel at times when we didn't have paid holidays already to areas to discover or to do something different. We left Africa back then. So actually that is one of the reasons why it is so important to look ahead, these enormous volumes, these enormous impacts that has on societies, and that we have to leave to find the solutions just for tourism. Whatever problem we see in tourism is actually a societal problem significantly larger. That was our discussion, Roland, the last time when we were here, that we have to advance in this area significantly. Here, this is then the argument. We are just this tiny little dot. Why should we act if the overall climate action or climate impact for the world by 2030 would be so much larger? But we changed that, and then we got lucky. In 2024, United Nations are declaring international years. They are declaring international days. There are several things declared. In 2024, the International Year for Sustainable and Resilient Tourism was declared by the United Nations General Assembly. And what we then did was saying the last time in 2017, that was a communications campaign. We made the argument for tourism for development, but this time, this is a perfect coincidence. So we combined, and that is actually the argument I'm making here today with all this prelude I had given so far. We are combining right now something which is bringing the attention to everybody in the tourism sector and into societies. The 2017 celebrations were global at all levels. They moved so many people in the tourism sector, and we combine it clever. We combine it in a way that whatever we have in here is designed to inform us for the post-2030 negotiation process. Because this time, I don't want to be just the one who is going there after one specific element, because we as an organization believe there has to be the opportunity to shape the tourism through these very important objectives and indicators, already very informed. And that is actually the opportunity which is building up. And before, Laura, we spoke about the process. When is it actually starting? Nobody really knows it, because actually it got postponed, and that is the big secret in the UN system. It should have been started already a year, 2 years ago. But the term of the current Secretary General is ending at the end of the year. And we do believe that the real negotiation process and how it is starting will be next year around June with the SDG summit. And there is then actually where we will roll out the roadmap, the consultative process, the negotiation logics. But whatever it will look like, very likely it will look like similar to what we have done right now, because it was, as I said before, since the MDGs, one of the most catalytic thing the United Nations did. It filtered down to levels we never imagined before. And it is guiding so many of our discussions, of our thinkings, that it couldn't be better than having something like that. So what we did yesterday, that was my excuse and my explanation why I came late. We passed that entire logic, which we consulted and prepared since the beginning of the year, through our governing body, and is now, right now, the legal framework for the celebrations of 2027, and informing ourselves the best way about what the futures are, and then later on the implications are, is what I very quickly will show you here. Because it might not be so interesting for those who are not working in tourism, but, and that was the clever thing, we are right now the only sector. My Secretary General, was 10 days ago at the Chief Executive Board in Tokyo. This is where all the heads of the UN agencies are meeting, retreating, and are reflecting about what to do. They do that twice a year. They didn't speak about the SDG process. Our side was prepared for, but we are the only economic activity right now systematically preparing for it. And that is cool. That is really cool, because as you will see, yesterday we had 36 ministers in the room. This is the governing body. The Executive Council in our case is like, well, in the UN, you know, the Security Council. So it is representative. So what we did, consulting all member states, and developed that and consulted that in all regional commissions. So all member states had a possibility to see it. We gave them a structure which brings that down to the national level. We enable in national committees. This is not a new structure. We have them very often in tourism. This is, Claire, where we have all the stakeholders reporting, reviewing regularly back to the ministries which are in charge of tourism. We strengthened them and we gave them responsibilities and a lot of entitlements, and they love that. So they are allowed right now then to authorize things like events, authorizing capacity building, and authorizing research. And we implemented in there tricky, nice little things, which actually bring then a lot of feedback to us. So our consultative mechanism, as you can imagine already, is exactly these national committees, which will then have the possibility to authorize events, but at the same time have then the obligation to report in these through these mechanisms back to us. but in a second more, because I think the most interesting element of that is capacity building. Flagship events. Claire, we will have one. You don't know, I didn't know much, but we will have one together in Africa because that is the UNESCO priority, Africa. So I'm very happy if we can shape it in the way how you were thinking before, because so far we were basically thinking that in the very classical cultural dimension. But what we do is one global conference per region, where we are covering in a non-redundant manner all the global subjects which are mandated by the international year and which are reflecting resilience and sustainability. Purpose, alignment. So that we, when we're going into the negotiation process and we see where tourism and UNESCO, where tourism and culture and education are sitting, that we are lobbying for the same SDG objective, the same SDG indicators, if we feel that that makes sense. But that is a process. And we do that with all the other relevant international organizations through these flagship events, that we are aligning that. And our membership is entirely involved. This is hosted by them. We consolidate that next year into our General Assembly, and then we are moving into the 2028 negotiation process, but maybe starting already, as I said before, at the beginning in 2027. That's what I mentioned before here, just so that you see these are the thematic structures for each of these flagship events. And capacity building, there's the trick. We spoke about implementation. We want that our member states are implementing. Capacity building always takes place. There's an abundance area of capacity building, but to next year be allowed to qualify for being capacity building under in support of the international year, we integrated over there one element which is very unique. Any kind of capacity building workshop which is taking place and authorized by the national committees has to actually focus on the national tourism policy. We want that the workshops are taking place and on whatever subject, but that they are taking the policy document into account. Whether they speak well or bad about it, we don't care. But be aware that it is existing. And Anna and Harald, you remember that when you prepared the first Insta report and you linked all the strategies relevant for for South Tyrol, that is exactly what we care about. Linking that policy discussion to capacity building, and then at the end, as I mentioned also so many times, bringing the feedback back to us. And what we are doing here, that's the last report. We are preparing the rolling report. We are collecting that on behalf of membership from the flagship events, from the UN process, and from our national committees. We are collecting them throughout the year, all the experiences, so that at the end of 2027, an international year which was designed basically for communication purposes, that we are coming out with a document informing our member states. That is what are the points. These are the points you could consider for the SDG negotiation process. And these are your partners. Whether this is then, you know how negotiations work in New York. You need to know who is a possible partner so that you lobby as a united front on those issues. And that is the added value we are preparing. So an informed negotiation process, yes. An informed negotiation process like we never have seen that before in the tourism sector, yes. A unique process in the UN system, yes. But we got lucky. And another thing, we have right now had the necessary expertise to be so bold as from the beginning. Because another thing I learned is if you ask the member states just about that, you will not hear it. There's the value when the UN comes into play, that we have seen these processes before, that we can basically suggest that, and then a lot of willingness is existing to embrace that. And with that, I just wanted to give you a glimpse at something which so far is always seen as hammered in stone. The SDGs, and each and every time, Roland, when I see somebody quoting from the SDGs, I still remember how we negotiated stupid language. But that was negotiated. It's not the Bible written by, it was negotiated language. We should not forget that. But it is quoted over and over and over, and nobody is questioning it. That is the funny thing. So I see that as one of the biggest opportunities for the future, to shape the future. If we are going in there the next time, well-aligned, well-informed, understanding what our tourism sector stands for and what possibilities we have. And thank you, Harald. Thank you, Roland, for organizing. Thank you to the president as well of giving here all the support. I will take a lot from this conference, especially through Harald and the regular feedback I'm getting. Thank you very much.